We have a very romanticized, very naive view of the scientific community. We like to imagine scientists as noble, enlightened scholars, sitting in sterile laboratories or dusty libraries, driven purely by the selfless pursuit of human knowledge. We think of them as elevated beings who have transcended the petty emotional squabbles of ordinary mortals. But science is not conducted by angels, it is conducted by human beings, and human beings, regardless of how many PhDs they have hanging on their walls, are fundamentally just highly educated toddlers with massive fragile ego. Welcome to the Academic Void. Today we're traveling back to the United States in the late 19th century. We're going to look at the birth of modern paleontology. We're going to look at two of the most brilliant, highly respected scientists of the Victorian era. Men who discovered some of the most famous dinosaurs in history. The Triceratops, the Stegosaurus, the Allosaurus. But we're not going to celebrate their genius. We're going to look at how these two men developed a rivalry so toxic, so deeply pathologically petty, that they completely lost their minds. They didn't just argue in academic journals, they spied on each other, they bribed each other's workers, they stole each other's fossils, and in the absolute peak of intellectual absurdity, they literally used dynamite to blow up priceless, millions of years old dinosaur bones, just so the other guy couldn't have them. In this video we are going to explore the Bone Wars. We'll look at what happens when you mix unlimited funding, the American Wild West, and the fragile egos of two men who would rather destroy history than share the credit. Put away your textbooks, grab a stick of dynamite, we're going in digging. To understand the sheer apocalyptic scale of this scientific mafia war, we have to introduce the combatants. In the red corner we have Othniel Charles Marsh. Marsh was a professor at Yale University. He wasn't particularly brilliant, but he had something much better than a high IQ, a very rich uncle. His uncle was George Peabody, a wealthy philanthropist who essentially bought Marsh his career and built him a massive museum at Yale. Marsh was a slow, methodical, and incredibly arrogant political operator. In the blue corner, we have Edward Drinker Cope. Cope was a wealthy Quaker from Philadelphia. Unlike Marsh, Cope was a genuine, undisputed prodigy. He published his first scientific paper at the age of 18. He was brilliant, but he was also impulsive, arrogant, and had a temper like a cornered wolverine. Initially, these two men were actually friends. They met in Europe, bonded over their love for fossils, and even named newly discovered species after each other. It was beautiful intellectual bromance. But the academic void does not tolerate friendship. It demands blood. The catalyst for the greatest feud in scientific history happened in 1868. Cope had discovered the fossilized remains of a massive, long-necked marine reptile called Elasmosaurus. He was incredibly proud of it. He reconstructed the skeleton, published a paper on it, and invited his good friend Marsh to come and admire his work. Marsh walked into the room, looked at the majestic skeleton, and immediately noticed a problem. Cope, the brilliant child prodigy, had made a mistake. A very stupid, very embarrassing mistake. Because the Elasmosaurus had such a ridiculously long neck and a short tail, Cope had accidentally put the skull on the tip of the tail instead of the neck. He had built a dinosaur that was essentially facing backward. Now a good friend would pull you aside, whisper in your ear and say, "Hey Ed, buddy, you might wanna flip the skull around before anyone else sees it." But Marsh was not a good friend. Marsh was a predator. Marsh didn't just point out the mistake, he pointed it out loudly. He humiliated Cope in front of their colleagues. He essentially called him a biological illiterate. Cope was so devastated and embarrassed that he frantically tried to buy up every single printed copy of the scientific journal that featured his backward dinosaur, just to destroy the evidence. But Marsh kept a few copies for himself just so he could occasionally remind Cope that he was an idiot. In that exact moment, their friendship died. The gloves came off. The Bone Wars had officially begun. In the 1870s, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad opened up the American West. And as they blasted through the rock of Wyoming, Colorado and Nebraska, they started finding bones. Massive, terrifying, impossible bones. Marsh and Cope realized that the West was an absolute gold mine of undiscovered species. They both headed west, armed with massive inheritance, and the espionage void was blown wide open. There was no longer a scientific endeavor, it was a turf war. Marsh and Cope didn't dig the bones themselves. They hired gangs of rough-hardened frontier workers to do the digging for them, and they explicitly ordered their teams to destroy the other side by any means necessary. Imagine the telegrams these highly educated Ivy League professors were sending to their foreman. Dear team leader, please ensure the careful extraction of the Jurassic vertebrae. Also, if you see Cope's team, throw rocks at their horses, steal their mail, and bribe their trained conductors to send their fossils to the wrong state. Sincerely, Professor Marsh. They hired spies to infiltrate each other's camps. If Cope found a massive fossil bed, Marsh spies would report back, and Marsh would immediately send a team to buy the land out from under Cope, or simply bribe Cope's workers to pack the bones into the crates and ship them to the Yale instead of Philadelphia. They were literally hijacking trains full of dinosaur bones. They would cover up their dig sites with dirt and brushes so the other team couldn't find them. They would spread fake rumors to the local towns about hostile Native American tribes just to scare the other team away from their fossil beds. It was the intellectual equivalent of the Bloods and the Crips fighting over the remains of Stegosaurus. But bribery and espionage weren't enough. The hatred between these two men eventually reached a level of toxicity that completely overrode their basic respects for science. Welcome to the destruction void. When a paleontologist finds a fossil bed, they carefully, meticulously extract the bones using tiny brushes and dental picks. It is a process that requires infinite patience because these artifacts are fragile, irreplaceable pieces of Earth's history. But Marsh and Cope were operating on a scorched earth policy. When one of their teams would finish digging up the best bones from the quarry, they knew that the other team would eventually show up, scavenging whatever was left, and they simply could not stomach the idea of their rival getting even a single useless toe bone. So they instituted the dynamite protocol. I want you to really process the absolute staggering absurdity of this. A dinosaur dies. Its bones sit in the earth for 65 million years. They survived the asteroid impact that wiped out 75% of life on Earth. They survived ice ages, tectonic shifts, and the dawn of humanity. They wait in the dark for 65 million years to be discovered. And then a guy named Othniel from Connecticut shows up, takes the bone he wants, and throws a stick of lit dynamite into the trench to blow the rest of the skeleton into a million pieces of useless dust, just so the guy named Edward can write a paper about it. They literally blew up priceless, undiscovered species of dinosaurs out of pure, unadulterated spite. They destroyed millions of years of biological history because they were acting like two toddlers fighting over a sandbox. This wasn't a science, it was a biological vandalism founded by the Ivy League endowments. Now, the ultimate goal of the Bone Wars wasn't just to collect bones, it was to name them. In paleontology, the person who publishes the papers first gets the glory of naming the new species. Because Marsh and Cope were so desperate to beat each other to the printing press, they completely abandoned the scientific method and entered the taxonomic void. When they received crates of crushed, mixed-up bones from their workers in the West, they didn't take the time to carefully assemble them. They just slapped them together like a panicked kid trying to finish a Lego set without the instructions. If Cope published a paper claiming he found a new species, Marsh would immediately publish a paper claiming he had found the exact same species a week earlier, but with a different name. They were inventing species that didn't exist. They were taking the legs of one dinosaur, attaching them to the ribs of another, and declaring it a groundbreaking discovery. This reckless, ego-driven sprint resulted in one of the most famous scientific errors in history, the Brontosaurus. In 1877, Marsh discovered the incomplete skeleton of a massive long-necked dinosaur. He named it Apatosaurus. 2 years later, his team found another, slightly larger skeleton. Because Marsh was in a frantic rush to crush Cope, he didn't realize it was just an adult version of the exact same dinosaur. He declared it a brand new species and named it Brontosaurus. But the skeleton was missing a skull. Now, did Marsh wait to find the correct skull? Absolutely not. He just grabbed the skull from a completely different dinosaur, a Camarasaurus, slapped it into the body and shipped it to the museum. Because of Marsh's ego, the entire world grew up believing in the Brontosaurus. It became one of the most famous dinosaurs in pop culture. It took the scientific community over a century to finally untangle the mess and officially declare that the Brontosaurus, as Marsh built it, was a complete fabrication. They weren't discovering the past, they were just aggressively hallucinating. If you wage a 30-year war of attrition, eventually you run out of ammunition, or in this case, you run out of money. By the 1890s, the Bone Wars had consumed both men entirely. They had spent their massive fortunes paying for spies, dynamite, and private trains. Cope had completely bankrupted himself. He had to sell off his beloved fossil collection just to pay his rent. He was living in a small, cramped apartment in Philadelphia, surrounded by piles of bones, completely isolated from his family. Marsh wasn't doing much better. He had used his political connections to get Cope cut from government funding, but Cope retaliated by taking his diaries to the New York Herald. Cope leaked decades of dirty secrets, accusing Marsh of plagiarism, corruption, and incompetence. The scandal was massive. It triggered a congressional investigation that ended up stripping Marsh of his government funding and forcing him to surrender a massive portion of his fossil collection to the Smithsonian. They had successfully achieved mutually assured destruction. They destroyed each other's finances, their reputations, and their sanity. But even in death, the pettiness did not stop. In 1897, Edward Drinker Cope died at the age of 56. But before he died, he issued one final psychotic challenge to his rival. At the time, there was a pseudoscientific belief that brain size directly correlated with human intelligence. Cope, wanting to prove once and for all that he was smarter than Marsh, donated his own head to science. He left strict instructions in his will that his brain was to be extracted, weighted and measured, and he publicly challenged Othniel Marsh to do the same when he died, so the world would finally know who had the bigger brain. Imagine the absolute staggering level of hatred required to weaponize your own autopsy. Cope literally turned his own corpse into a final insult. He wanted his brain put on a scale just to win an argument from beyond the grave. Marsh, perhaps realizing that this was the most unhinged challenge in the history of academia, declined to participate. He died 2 years later, completely broke, with exactly $18 in his bank account. The Bone Wars are the ultimate paradox of human achievement. On one hand, Marsh and Cope are the founding fathers of paleontology. Before they started fighting, there were only 9 known species of dinosaurs in North America. By the time they finished destroying each other, they had discovered and named 136 new species. They filled the museums of the world. They introduced humanity to Triceratops, the Diplodocus and the Stegosaurus. But on the other hand, they set the science of paleontology back by decades. They destroyed countless priceless fossils with dynamite. They cluttered the academic record with fake species and rushed sloppy research that took generations of actual responsible scientists to clean up. It proves that brilliance and wisdom are two completely different things. You can still be smart enough to identify a 150-million-year-old femur in the dirt and still be stupid enough to blow it up because you are mad at a guy from Philadelphia. The next time you walk into a natural history museum and look up at the majestic towering skeleton of a dinosaur, don't just think about the majestic creature that ruled the earth millions of years ago. Think about the two petty, arrogant, dynamite-wielding toddlers who dug them up. Stay strange, stay sharp, and whatever you do, don't put a head on the tail. See ya.